James Davis knelt in the soil, his hands deep in the earth as he carefully examined the roots of his tomato plants. The rich scent of fresh dirt filled his lungs, and he smiled. Retirement had given him something money couldn't buy: peace. For 30 years, he had stood in front of chalkboards, grading papers and shaping young minds. Now he had traded textbooks for seed catalogs, lesson plans for planning schedules. His 5-acre farm on the outskirts of Maple Creek Estates was his pride and joy. Everything he had worked for had led him here. And then she arrived. The sharp click of high heels on gravel made James look up. A woman in a crisp white blouse and designer sunglasses stood at the edge of his property, arms crossed, her lips pressed so tightly together they looked like a thin pencil line. "You can't grow food here," she announced, her voice sharp, commanding, like a principal scolding a misbehaving student. "This isn't some backwoods farming town." James straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. "Excuse me?" She sighed impatiently, gesturing toward his rows of crops. This isn't allowed. I'm Eleanor Whitfield, president of the Maple Creek Homeowners Association. And your little," she waved a hand dismissively, "operation is in violation of at least 6 community guidelines." James raised an eyebrow. "My operation?" "This so-called farm," she said, her nose wrinkling as if the word itself offended her. James let out a slow breath. He had heard stories about HOAs, strict rules, endless fines, overzealous board members with too much time and too little kindness. But he wasn't part of their HOA. His farm had been here long before Maple Creek Estates was even built. "My land isn't under your HOA," he said simply. "It's zoned for agriculture." Eleanor pulled out her phone and snapped photos of his crops. "These weeds are an eyesore. The neighbors are already complaining about bugs and odors. This affects our property values." James clenched his jaw. "These aren't weeds. They're organic vegetables. And there are no odors. I don't even have livestock." Her lips curled into a smug smirk. "Expect an official notice soon," she said, turning on her heel. James watched as she marched away, her spotless white shoes crunching over the gravel. The sun was warm on his back, but a chill ran down his spine. Something told him this wasn't over. That night, James sat at his kitchen table, legal documents spread out before him. The warm glow of the overhead light flickered against the yellowed pages of his property deed. He traced a finger over the words: "Zone for agricultural use. Established farmland." If Eleanor wanted to fight, he wasn't going in blind. 3 days later, he found a thick envelope taped to his door. Notice of violation. James unfolded the letter, scanning the words. "You have 14 days to remove all agricultural activities or face fines of $100 per day." He exhaled sharply. So it had begun. Instead of getting angry, he picked up the phone and called the county records office. "Mr. Davis, your property is definitely zoned agricultural." The clerk confirmed. "The HOA has no jurisdiction over your land. Would you like official documentation?" "Yes, please," James said. "Email and certified mail if possible." That evening, armed with undeniable proof, he wrote a polite but firm letter to the HOA, attaching copies of his zoning documents and property maps. He walked into the HOA office the next morning. The receptionist blinked in surprise when he placed the letter on the desk. "Make sure Eleanor gets this," James said, offering a tight smile. A week passed. No response. Then one evening, as he harvested bell peppers, his neighbor Jeff stopped by, leaning on the fence. "They were talking about you at the HOA meeting last night." Jeff said, "That Eleanor woman has it out for you." James wiped his hands on his jeans. "What did she say?" Jeff took a bite of a fresh pepper James had handed him. "She called your place the eyesore farm and said they needed to take action before others got the same idea. Some folks disagreed, but she wouldn't let it go." James felt his jaw tighten. "Did they mention my letter? The zoning documents?" Jeff shook his head. "Nope. She acted like she never got anything from you." James felt something crack inside him. This wasn't about property values anymore. This was personal. That evening, James went to a hardware store and bought security cameras. He wasn't letting this go unnoticed. 2 days later, His cameras caught 3 HOA members in polo shirts walking through his farm while he was at the market. They weren't just looking. They were pulling up carrot tops, poking at vegetables, and taking notes. James watched the footage in disbelief. There was Eleanor leading them, pointing angrily at his plants. That night, another notice appeared on his door. The fines had increased to $250 per day, retroactive to their first notice. At the bottom, in Eleanor's looping handwriting, was a note. Perhaps now you'll take us seriously. James exhaled sharply and called his lawyer friend, Sarah. Don't pay a cent, she said after hearing his story. They're hoping you'll crack under pressure. So what do I do? Document everything. Send another letter by certified mail, so they can't claim they didn't receive it. And put up no trespassing signs immediately. That afternoon, James put up big, bold signs all around his farm. This wasn't just about vegetables anymore. This was about his home, his rights, and his future. The next morning, James woke to the sound of machinery. He rushed outside, his heart pounding. A landscaping truck was parked at the road, and 2 men with weed trimmers were heading toward his tomato beds. Stop right there, James shouted, running toward them. This is private property. One of the men hesitated. We have orders from a Maple Creek HOA to clean up this area. James pointed at his no trespassing signs. This property is not part of Maple Creek. If you cut down my crops, you could be liable for damages. The men exchanged uneasy glances. I don't blame you, James said, but if you touch my plants, you'll be in legal trouble. That was enough to convince them. They apologized and left. But James was shaking with anger as he called Sarah again. This has gone beyond harassment, he said. They tried to destroy my crops. Sarah's voice was firm. Then it's time to go on the defensive. Everything. That evening, James installed bright orange survey markers along his property line. He set up a hidden trail camera covering the area where the landscapers had tried to cut his crops. As the sun set, he stood in the middle of his farm, looking at the land he had worked so hard for. Why couldn't Eleanor just leave him alone? Little did he know, her next move would push him to fight not just for his land, but for his entire way of life. And he would not back down. James always started his mornings the same way. Hot coffee, a slow walk through his farm, and a quiet moment of gratitude for the life he had built. But this morning, something felt off. His gut told him to check the security footage. He sat at his kitchen table, opened his laptop, and clicked into the live camera feed. His heart nearly stopped. There they were, 6 people in HOA polo shirts, walking through his farm like it was their own backyard. James leaned closer, his stomach twisting. They weren't just looking. They were stealing his tomatoes, his zucchini, his bell peppers, all being plucked right off the vines and tossed into baskets. And leading them, Eleanor Whitfield. James slammed his coffee mug down so hard on the table that hot liquid sloshed over the side. He grabbed his phone and called Sarah, his lawyer. Sarah, he said, voice tight, they're stealing my crops. Right now. James, listen to me, she said calmly. Do not confront them alone. Call the police. I'll be there in 15 minutes. James's hand shook as he dialed 911. This wasn't just about fines anymore. They were taking his livelihood right out from under him. James pulled up his truck, gravel crunching under his tires. His hands clenched the steering wheel, so tightly his knuckles turned white. Eleanor stood in the middle of his farm, barking orders. Take the cucumbers, too, she instructed. If we leave them, they'll just rot. James stepped out of his truck, his voice booming. Drop everything, right now. The HOA members froze, baskets full of stolen produce in their hands. Eleanor turned, completely unbothered. Oh, James, she said with a smile that made his blood boil. You weren't maintaining your yard properly, so we figured we'd help ourselves before the food went to waste. James felt his pulse in his ears. This food wasn't waste. This was his hard work. Thomas Jenkins, the HOA treasurer, bit into one of James's prized Cherokee purple tomatoes, juice running down his chin. James took a slow, deliberate step forward. That's a $6 tomato, he said. You want to pay for it? Thomas smirked. It's a little salty. James's fist clenched. This is private property. You're trespassing. And you're stealing. Eleanor rolled her eyes. James, we're the HOA. We have every right to enforce community standards. No, you don't. James snapped. You've seen my documents. My farm isn't part of your HOA. Eleanor gave a slow, knowing smile. Documents can be changed. James's stomach dropped. What do you mean by that? Eleanor tilted her head. We've already spoken to the county about rezoning this area. You'll be receiving a notice soon. James barely had time to process the weight of those words before the sound of sirens filled the air. A police cruiser pulled up, and Officer Martinez stepped out. James exhaled, his hands still shaking. Officer, he said, pointing to the HOA members, they're trespassing and stealing from my farm. Eleanor stepped forward, all confidence. Officer, we were simply conducting a routine HOA inspection of community grounds, she said smoothly. Martinez frowned. James's farm is under the HOA's jurisdiction. That's debatable, Eleanor said. James felt a new kind of anger rise in his chest. They were trying to gaslight him. Martinez turned to James. Do you have proof of ownership and zoning? In my house, James said, and I have security footage of them stealing. For the first time, Eleanor's confidence wavered. Sarah pulled up, stepping out her car with legal documents in hand. Officer, my client wishes to press charges for trespassing and theft, she said. Eleanor's face turned red. This is outrageous. Martinez sighed. Ma'am, return the stolen produce and leave this property immediately. A ripple of shock went through the HOA members. They hesitated. You heard the man, James said. Put it back. One by one, they dropped the stolen vegetables onto the ground. As they walked back toward the road, Eleanor turned back. This isn't over, she hissed. James met her gaze without blinking. I know. And he meant it. That night, James sat at his kitchen table, staring at the email he had just received. Dear Mr. Davis, this email confirms receipt of application HCR 2022-47, requesting rezoning of parcels, including your property, from agricultural to residential. HOA public comment period begins in 30 days. James felt the blood drain from his face. They were really doing it. They were trying to rezone his farm. His phone rang. Sarah, they're playing the long game, she said. If they succeed, you'll be forced to sell, or worse, your farm will be condemned. James gripped the edge of the table. What do we do? Sarah's voice was firm. We fight back, but we'll need help. James did something he never thought he'd do. He called the local newspaper. When the editor answered, James didn't waste time. Maple Creek HOA is trying to force a legally operating farm out of existence through harassment, trespassing, and theft. I have video evidence. There was a pause. Then, we'll send a reporter tomorrow. The next morning, James met Jenny Kim, a young but sharp-eyed journalist. You're saying the HOA is trying to steal your land? She asked, clicking on her recorder. James nodded. And I have proof. He played the security footage of Eleanor and Thomas picking his vegetables, cutting his irrigation lines, vandalizing his signs. Jenny's eyes widened. That's brazen. They think they're untouchable, James said. Jenny jotted down notes. Mind if I speak to some neighbors? Please do, James said. The truth is all I want. The next morning, James stepped outside and froze. His "No trespassing" sign lay in splinters. A message was spray-painted on the broken wood. This is HOA property. James's jaw clenched. He stormed back inside, pulled up his security footage, and fast-forwarded to the night before. There they were, Eleanor and Thomas, 3:17 a.m., hammers in hand, caught in the act. James smiled. Gotcha. That was coming. The next morning, a black SUV screeched to a stop in front of James's farm. Eleanor stormed out, furious. You called the press? She demanded. James smirked. Sure did. And tomorrow, your little HOA scandal is going to be front-page news. Eleanor's face twisted with rage. You'll regret this. James took a step forward. No, he said, voice steady. You will, because this time he wasn't just defending his farm. He was taking the fight to them. James sat on the edge of the hard wooden bench in the courthouse, rubbing his hands together to keep them from shaking. He wasn't nervous about speaking. He wasn't nervous about facing Eleanor and Thomas, who sat across the aisle, pretending they weren't sweating through their expensive suits. He was nervous because today, after months of fighting, losing sleep, and nearly losing hope, everything would be decided. Sarah, his lawyer, placed a reassuring hand on his arm. Remember, she whispered, the truth is on our side. He nodded. The bailiff's voice rang through the room. All rise for Judge Harriet Thompson. A hush fell over the courtroom as the judge entered, her expression unreadable. She sat, adjusting her glasses, then looked over the documents before her. I've reviewed the filings, she said. This is quite the neighborhood dispute. James took a slow breath. This isn't a neighborhood dispute, Sarah said, standing. This is about a group of people abusing their power to try and steal my client's land. Eleanor stiffened in her seat. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. Judge Thompson turned her sharp gaze to the HOA's attorney. Counsel for the HOA, she said, please explain why your client believe they have authority over property clearly marked as agricultural on county zoning maps. The lawyer cleared his throat, standing. He forced a smile. Your Honor, while technically outside HOA boundaries, my client believes Mr. Davis's farm creates a significant negative impact on community property values. Our position is that the judge held up a hand, cutting him off. That wasn't my question. A ripple of tension spread through the courtroom. James caught Eleanor's eye across the room. For the first time, she looked nervous. Sarah stood tall, confident. Your Honor, we have overwhelming evidence that this HOA has engaged in harassment, trespassing, and even theft against my client. She clicked a button on her laptop. The large courtroom screen flickered to life, and then the security footage played. First, the video of Eleanor and her group marching through James's farm, filling baskets with his vegetables. Then, the footage of Thomas Jenkins sneaking onto farm at 2 a.m., wire cutters in hand, slashing the irrigation pipes. Then, the final nail in the coffin, Eleanor and Thomas, under the glow of a security light, smashing James's no trespassing sign to pieces. Gasps filled the room. James turned slightly in his seat. Several HOA board members refused to meet his gaze. Judge Thompson leaned forward, her face unreadable. She turned Eleanor. Mrs. Whitfield, is that you in this video? Eleanor swallowed hard. Well, yes or no? The judge asked firmly. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. Yes. The judge turned to Thomas. Mr. Jenkins, do you deny cutting irrigation pipes? Thomas fidgeted, his face pale. We were investigating a water leak, he mumbled. At 2 a.m., the judge said dryly, with wire cutters. A few people chuckled. James closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the weight of relief settle over him. They finally had to face the truth. Sarah wasn't done. Your Honor, she said, we have one more witness. Angela Winters, former HOA secretary. James sat up straighter. Angela? He barely knew her. What was she about to say? Angela walked to the witness stand, adjusting the microphone. She took a deep breath. Mrs. Whitfield specifically targeted Mr. Davis's farm after Mr. Jenkins proposed a development plan for that land. James's heart stopped. Development plan? Judge Thompson narrowed her eyes. Explain. Angela glanced at the HOA table before straightening her shoulders. Thomas Jenkins wanted to develop condos on that land, she said. But he couldn't do it unless Mr. Davis sold. Eleanor told the board that if we couldn't buy him out, we'd force him out. A wave of whispers filled the courtroom. Sarah turned to the judge. Your Honor, this proves the HOA's actions were never about property values. This was about a real estate scam. Eleanor's face had gone white. Thomas was practically sinking into his chair. The judge banged her gavel. Order in the court. She turned to Thomas. Mr. Jenkins, is this true? Thomas opened his mouth. No words came out. That was all the answer the judge needed. Judge Thompson leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "I presided over many HOA disputes," she said, "but this goes far beyond a disagreement over property rules." James's breath caught in his throat. "I find overwhelmingly in favor of the plaintiff," she continued. "The Maple Creek HOA has no legal authority over this farm. Furthermore, the actions taken against Mr. Davis constitute harassment, trespassing, and theft." James felt a sudden pressure behind his eyes. He had won. The HOA is ordered to pay $443,500 in damages, the judge said. "Additionally, I am issuing a permanent injunction prohibiting any HOA member from entering Mr. Davis's property without written permission." Then she turned to Eleanor and Thomas. "And more concerning, this case reveals evidence of fraud and criminal mischief. I am referring this matter to the district attorney for potential criminal charges." Eleanor gasped. Thomas visibly paled. The gavel fell. It was over. James had barely processed his victory when he pulled into his driveway that evening. And then he saw them. A line of cars. A group of people, neighbors, strangers, even former HOA members, standing outside his farm, holding tools baskets and supplies. Mrs. Rodriguez, one of his longtime neighbors, stepped forward. "We heard about the ruling," she said. "We're here to help." James blinked. "Help with what?" "Fixing what they destroyed," she said simply. James felt his throat tighten. For months, he had fought this battle alone. And now, he wasn't alone anymore. That afternoon, people who had once been strangers knelt in the soil, planting new crops, repairing fences, rebuilding what had been lost. Even Angela Winters came by. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry," she said softly. James nodded, offering her a small smile. "Thank you." That night, as he stood on his porch, watching his newly restored farm glow under the setting sun, his phone buzzed. It was an email from the new HOA president, Mr. Ramirez. "We voted unanimously to create a permanent easement in our bylaws, recognizing your farm's agricultural status. No future board will ever challenge it again." James swallowed hard. For the first time in months, he felt truly at peace. Epilogue: the legacy of the land. Weeks later, James put up a new sign at the entrance to his farm. "Community garden lessons, Saturdays at 9 a.m. All welcome." And on that first Saturday, over 20 people showed up. Children who had never seen a tomato plant before got their hands in the dirt. Neighbors who had once feared the HOA now stood together, growing food, growing trust, growing something more than crops. And James? He had gained something far greater than a legal victory. He had gained a community. The end.